Story 1. Story 1, The Fluorescent Hum. The clock on the microwave glowed 11:57 p.m. Another 3 minutes until my shift officially started. I peeled the plastic film off a lukewarm burrito, the sterile scent of processed cheese filling the small break room. Outside, the asphalt of the parking lot shimmered under the sodium vapor lamps, the rest of the world swallowed by inky blackness. I worked the graveyard shift at Derwent Plastics, monitoring the injection molding machines. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. "Hey, newbie," Gary, the outgoing shift supervisor, grunted, his face etched with weariness. "Everything quiet tonight?" "Seems like it," I mumbled, my mouth full of burrito. He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Famous last words. "This place has a personality." He didn't elaborate, just clapped me on the shoulder and shuffled out. The fluorescent lights of the factory floor hummed, a constant, buzzing drone. Rows and rows of identical machines stretched into the dimly lit distance, their rhythmic hissing and clicking echoing in the cavernous space. I made my rounds, checking gauges, noting temperatures, the routine settling over me like a heavy blanket. Around 2 a.m., a strange smell, acrid and metallic, tickled my nostrils. I couldn't pinpoint the source. The machines all seemed to be functioning normally. I chalked it up to a quirk of the ventilation system. An hour later, I heard it. A faint tapping, coming from the far end of the factory. I walked towards the sound, my boots echoing on the concrete floor. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from inside one of the machines. I checked the control panel, everything normal. But the tapping persisted, now accompanied by a low, guttural growl. I told myself it was just the machinery, the pressure building up, some strange resonance. But a cold dread started to seep into my bones. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I quickened my pace, wanting to get back to the relative safety of the break room. As I passed row 17, the machines closest to the loading dock, the lights flickered, plunging the area into momentary darkness. When they flickered back on, a shape stood silhouetted against the far wall. It was tall, impossibly thin, almost skeletal. It didn't move, but I could feel its presence, a palpable weight in the air. My heart hammered in my chest. I blinked, and it was gone. I ran back to the break room, fumbling for my phone. No signal. I tried the landline. Dead. I was trapped. The tapping started again, closer this time. And then, a new sound, a low, rhythmic breathing, like a bellows working overtime. I huddled in the corner, my eyes darting around the small room, searching for an escape. The fluorescent light above buzzed and flickered, casting long, distorted shadows. The breathing grew louder, closer, filling the room with a putrid, metallic stench. I pressed my hands against my ears, trying to block out the sounds, the smells, the encroaching terror. Suddenly, everything stopped. The tapping, the breathing, the humming of the lights. Silence. A heavy, oppressive silence that pressed down on me, suffocating me. I waited, my breath held tight in my chest, every muscle tense. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Finally, I forced myself to move, inching towards the door. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling. The lights flickered again, and for a fleeting moment, I saw it reflected in the break room window. The tall, skeletal figure, its face obscured by shadow, its eyes burning with an unnatural light. Then darkness. The power went out, plunging the factory into absolute blackness. I screamed, a desperate, choked sound lost in the echoing void. I fumbled for the door, my fingers scrabbling at the cold metal. Then, a voice, close to my ear, whispered, "You're not alone." I bolted, my hands outstretched, stumbling through the darkness, the metallic smell thick in the air. I could hear the rhythmic breathing again, closer now, right behind me. I ran blindly, crashing into machinery, my skin scraped and bleeding. I had to get out. I had to escape. I finally reached the loading dock door, throwing my weight against it. It wouldn't budge. Locked. I pounded on the metal, screaming for help, but my voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. Then, the lights flickered back on. The factory floor was empty. The machine stood silent and still. The only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. I slumped against the door, my body shaking, my mind reeling. Had I imagined it? Was it a hallucination? The exhaustion, the isolation. I glanced at the clock on the wall. 6:57 a.m. My shift was over. I pushed open the loading dock door, blinking in the early morning light. The parking lot was empty. My car was gone. The metallic smell lingered in the air. Story 2. Story 2, the fluorescent hum. The clock ticked, each second a tiny hammer blow against the silence of the deserted office building. 2:17 a.m. Another night shift at Lawson & Sons, another graveyard stretch of fluorescent hum and stale coffee. I swiveled in my creaky chair, the cheap plethora sticking to my skin. Outside, the city lights blurred through the rain-streaked windows, a hazy orange glow against the inky blackness. "Everything all right, Sarah?" Mark's voice, crackling through the intercom, startled me. He was the security guard downstairs, a kindly older man with a perpetually worried frown. "Yeah, fine," I replied, my voice a little shaky. "Just jumpy, I guess." "Understandable." "Quiet night." "Too quiet." He was right. It was unnervingly quiet. Usually, even at this hour, there was the distant rumble of traffic, the occasional siren wail. Tonight, nothing. Just the oppressive silence and the insistent hum of the overhead lights. I returned to my work, trying to lose myself in the spreadsheets on my screen, but a prickling sensation crawled across my scalp. The feeling of being watched. I glanced around the deserted office, shadows stretching and contorting in the corners of my vision. Just my imagination, I told myself. An hour crawled by. The silence deepened, pressing in on me like a physical weight. Then, I heard it. A faint scratching sound, coming from the vent above my desk. I froze, listening intently. It stopped. I took a deep breath, trying to dismiss it as the building settling, the old pipes groaning. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The scratching returned, louder this time, more insistent. A chill snaked down my spine. I reached for the intercom. "Mark? Did you hear that?" "Static." "Mark?" I repeated, my voice rising in pitch. Still nothing but static. I slammed my hand down on the intercom button. Silence. The line was dead. Panic clawed at the edges of my reason. I stood up, my legs trembling, and backed away from my desk. The scratching continued, relentless, maddening. Then, a new sound joined the chorus, a soft, wet slithering, coming from somewhere behind me. I whirled around, my heart hammering against my ribs. Nothing. Just the empty office, bathed in the sickly yellow light. I told myself it was the wind, the rain, anything but what my gut was screaming at me. I had to get out. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the door, fumbling with the lock in my haste. It wouldn't budge. I rattled the handle, panic rising like bile in my throat. Locked. From the inside. I spun around, searching the office for something, anything, to defend myself with. My eyes fell on the heavy metal stapler on my desk. It wouldn't be much, but it was better than nothing. I crept back towards my desk, the scratching above me growing louder, the slithering closer. As I reached for the stapler, a shadow flickered in the corner of my eye. I turned, and a wave of icy terror washed over me. Standing in the doorway, partially obscured by the shadows, was a figure. Tall and gaunt, its face shrouded in darkness. It didn't move, didn't speak. Just stood there, watching me. My breath hitched in my throat. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. I could only stare, frozen in place, as the figure slowly began to advance towards me. The scratching intensified, the slithering grew louder, closer. The figure took another step, and I saw a glint of something metallic in its hand. Something long and sharp. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing myself for the inevitable. But it never came. I opened my eyes cautiously. The figure was gone. The scratching stopped. The slithering ceased. The only sound was the persistent hum of the fluorescent lights. I stumbled back to the door, my hand shaking so violently I could barely turn the knob. This time, it unlocked. I flung the door open and ran, not stopping until I reached the street, the cold night air stinging my lungs. I never went back to Lawson and Sons. I never even called to explain. The memory of that night, the scratching, the slithering, the figure in the shadows, haunts me still. Sometimes, when I'm alone in the quiet of my apartment, I hear it again. The faint scratching in the walls, the soft, wet slithering just behind me. And I wonder, was it real? Or was it just the product of a sleep-deprived mind, trapped in the oppressive silence of the night shift? And then, I see a flicker in the corner of my eye, a shadow moving just beyond my peripheral vision, and I know. I'm not alone. Story 3. Story 3, The Fluorescent Hum. The clock ticked with exaggerated slowness, each second an eternity in the sterile silence of the archive room. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow on the endless rows of metal shelves. It was my third week on the night shift at the Historical Society, a job I'd taken out of desperation. The pay was lousy, the hours were worse, but it was a job. Tonight, the usual quiet was unsettling. Usually, the distant rumble of traffic provided a thin veil of normalcy, a reminder that the world outside still existed. But tonight, nothing. Just the hum of the lights and the faint whisper of the ventilation system. I shivered, pulling my cardigan tighter around me. It wasn't cold, not really. It was more a creeping unease, a prickling at the back of my neck that wouldn't go away. I glanced at the clock again, 2:17 a.m. 3 more hours to go. I tried to focus on my task, cataloguing a box of old photographs, but the silence was oppressive. Every small noise, every creak of the building, every rustle of paper, amplified in the stillness, sent a jolt of anxiety through me. Then I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, coming from somewhere deep within the archive. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear over the hum of the lights. It stopped. I waited, heart hammering in my chest, but it didn't start again. Just the pipes, I muttered to myself, trying to sound convinced. I forced myself to continue working, but the unease remained, a cold knot in my stomach. The tapping started again, a little louder this time, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the back of the room, from behind the towering shelves that stretched towards the ceiling. I hesitantly got up, my legs feeling strangely heavy. As I walked towards the back, the tapping grew louder, morphing into a distinct, deliberate knock. I stopped in front of the last row of shelves, the metal cold against my fingertips. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. Silence. Then, a single, sharp knock. It came from directly behind the shelves. I reached out, my hand trembling, and pulled on the heavy metal handle. The shelves slid open with a grating screech, revealing a narrow passageway, shrouded in darkness. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The passageway was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, and stretched back into the depths of the building. The air was thick with the smell of dust and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet. The knocking started again, further down the passageway. Hesitantly, I stepped inside, the shelves sliding closed behind me with a resounding clang. The darkness pressed in around me, the beam of my phone my only guide. The knocking continued, drawing me deeper into the unknown. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my ears, the metallic scent growing stronger. The passageway opened into a small, windowless room. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. In the center of the room, a single bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a dim, flickering light. And there, beneath the bulb, was a small, wooden table. On the table, a single object lay bathed in the pale light. A metronome. Its brass pendulum swung back and forth with a steady, hypnotic rhythm, the source of the knocking that had led me here. I stared at it, mesmerized, a strange sense of dread washing over me. The room felt wrong, charged with an unseen energy. The air was thick with a palpable tension, a feeling of being watched. Suddenly, the metronome stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I held my breath, straining to hear anything over the pounding of my own heart. Then, a low, guttural growl echoed from the shadows in the corner of the room. My blood ran cold. I spun around, my flashlight beam frantically searching the darkness. Nothing. But the growl came again, closer this time, accompanied by a shuffling sound. I backed away, my hand shaking so violently I could barely hold the phone. The shuffling grew louder, closer. I could feel the presence of something in the room with me, something unseen, something malevolent. The air grew colder, the metallic scent stronger, almost overwhelming. I stumbled back, my heel catching on something on the floor. I fell, the phone flying from my hand, the beam of light extinguishing against the wall. I scrambled back, my hand scrabbling against the cold concrete floor, my breath catching in my throat. The growling stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the frantic beating of my own heart. I lay there, paralyzed with fear, waiting for something. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Slowly, cautiously, I reached out, my fingers brushing against the cold metal of my phone. I fumbled for the power button, my heart leaping into my throat as the screen flickered to life. I pointed the beam towards the corner, my hand trembling. Empty. The room was empty. The metronome was still, its pendulum hanging motionless. The only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights from somewhere far away, a distant reminder of the world outside this suffocating darkness. I scrambled to my feet, backing away towards the passageway. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I fumbled my way back through the narrow passage, the shelves sliding open with a grating screech that seemed to echo through the empty archive. I burst back into the main room, gasping for breath, the fluorescent lights blindingly bright after the oppressive darkness of the passageway. I stumbled towards the exit, my legs weak, my mind racing. I never went back to the archive. I quit the next day, without explanation. I tried to forget about what happened that night, but the memory lingers, a cold knot of fear in the pit of my stomach. The silence, the knocking, the metallic scent, the growling, it haunts me still. And sometimes, in the dead of night, when the world is quiet, I can still hear it. A faint, rhythmic tapping, coming from somewhere just beyond the reach of the light. Story 4. Story 4, The Fluorescent Hum. The fluorescent lights of the gas station convenience store buzzed, a monotonous drone that usually faded into the background. Tonight, though, it gnawed at my nerves. I rubbed my tired eyes, the 3 a.m. slump settling in. Slow night? I asked Mrs. Henderson, the owner, a woman whose wrinkles seemed to hold a lifetime of graveyard shift stories. Dead, she rasped, her voice like dry leaves skittering across pavement. You'd think folks would need more coffee and cigarettes at this hour. I chuckled, a dry, tired sound. She was right. Usually, the late-night rush of truckers and insomniacs kept me busy. Tonight, the only company was the humming lights and the occasional rustle of Mrs. Henderson rearranging the dusty shelves. An hour crawled by. Outside, the wind picked up, whispering against the glass doors. A shiver ran down my spine, a cold that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I glanced at the security monitor, the grainy black and white image showing the deserted parking lot. Empty. Except, was that something moving at the edge of the screen? A flicker, too fast to register. Did you see that? I asked, my voice tight. Mrs. Henderson peered at the monitor. See what, dear? Shadows playing tricks. I dismissed it, but the unease remained. A prickling sensation danced on the back of my neck. The fluorescent hum intensified, vibrating through the floor and up into my bones. The air grew thick, heavy, making it difficult to breathe. Another hour passed. The feeling of being watched intensified. I felt eyes on me, burning into my skin, but every time I looked up, the store was empty. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, more menacing. The rustling from the shelves stopped. "Mrs. Henderson?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. Silence. I walked towards the back, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead, casting grotesque shadows that danced and writhed. The storage room door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open, the hinges groaning like a tortured animal. Empty. "Mrs. Henderson?" I called again, louder this time. My voice echoed back to me, hollow and distorted. Then, I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the back of the store, near the coolers. My blood ran cold. I grabbed a mop handle, my hand trembling. Slowly, I crept towards the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. The growl grew louder, closer. It was mixed with something else now, a wet, slithering sound that made my stomach churn. The fluorescent lights above began to flicker violently, the buzzing intensifying, a deafening drone. I rounded the corner, the mop handle raised. The coolers stood open, their contents spilled onto the floor, a mess of melting ice cream and broken glass. The air reeked of something metallic, something wrong. And then I saw it. A glimpse. A flash of something huge, dark, and impossibly shaped, moving in the shadows. Its eyes, two burning embers, fixed on me. I screamed, a primal sound of pure terror. The creature lunged, a blur of darkness and teeth. I swung the mop handle, a desperate, futile attempt to defend myself. It connected with something solid, a sickening crunch echoing through the store. Then, silence. The fluorescent lights flickered back to their steady hum. The air cleared, the metallic stench fading. The creature was gone. I stood there, trembling, the mop handle still clutched in my hand. I looked around, the store a chaotic mess. The coolers were empty, their contents strewn across the floor. There was something else. Something dark and viscous coating the floor, shimmering under the fluorescent lights. And a single, enormous footprint, unlike anything I'd ever seen, imprinted in the spilled ice cream. I backed away slowly, my eyes fixed on the footprint. Where was Mrs. Henderson? What was that thing? My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd just witnessed. Suddenly, the security monitor flickered to life. The grainy black and white image showed the parking lot. Empty. Except, at the edge of the screen, something moved. A flicker. Then, two burning embers stared directly into the camera. And a low, guttural growl echoed from the speakers. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The fluorescent lights hummed, a monotonous drone that seemed to mock my fear. I was alone. Trapped. And whatever was out there, it was watching. Waiting. The fluorescent hum grew louder, filling my ears, drowning out all other sounds. It vibrated through the floor, up my legs, into my chest, until it felt like my bones were humming along. The humming grew louder, louder, until it was all I could hear, all I could feel. And then, everything went black. The last thing I remember is the humming. The relentless, deafening hum of the fluorescent lights.